When news rippled in a series of alerts and tweets last night that our 95-year-old Queen had contracted COVID, few would have mustered little more than a brief exchange over Sunday roast. A year ago, that reaction would have been dramatically different. The nation would have been gripped by hysteria. The fact that this news is not dominating headlines is symbolic of how far we've come in tackling COVID, ahead of the government unveiling plans today to remove all restrictions in England so that we may learn to live with the virus. While many applaud the move, making England a world leader in coming out of the other side of the pandemic, with supportive scientists saying the date of this seminal moment is relatively immaterial, others are warning that it sends out the wrong message that the risk of COVID has been eliminated. With opposition benches pushing back against the suggestion that free COVID testing could be withdrawn, the Health Secretary and Chancellor have been locked in discussions, delaying Cabinet's approval of the plans ahead of the Prime Minister once again joining Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance behind the COVID lecterns this evening. But could this be for the very last time? Joining me first on the show is Labour MP for Blackley and Broughton, Graham Stringer. Graham, what do you think about the idea that all COVID restrictions could be lifted?
I think if we think who's at risk at the present time, it's people with damaged immune systems, it's the very old, it's the people who've always been most at risk during this epidemic. Most of the rest of us, including the Queen, are relatively safe because we've been vaccinated or we already had the disease. So carrying on with the restrictions and spending oodles of money on unnecessary testing, particularly of children, and vaccinating children unnecessarily, which is probably damaging them in schools, I think we should finish and get back to a more or less normal life. I think we should still allow testing for those people who are likely to come into contact with the vulnerable groups I've just mentioned, because those people need protecting. But most of the rest of us are less at risk from this disease at the moment than we would be from flu.
Now, your party is pushing back against the suggestion that free COVID testing could be scrapped, and that's actually led for this protracted meeting that's delayed Cabinet approval of proposals between the Chancellor and the Health Secretary, where we understand that free testing may still be available, but it won't be from an extra budget, a surplus budget provided by the Exchequer. Do you think that's the right move, or do you think we should just get rid of free testing altogether?
Well, I think, as I've said, free testing that will protect the vulnerable members of our community is the right thing to do. Those people who are often old or they've been in hospital for a long time or have just come out of hospital need to have every facility they can to protect themselves, and that must include testing. But the ridiculous amount of testing that goes on in schools and for everywhere else, I mean, does it matter if you've got COVID with mild symptoms? The disease itself can be transmitted when you've not got symptoms or when you've got symptoms. I think you've just got to learn to live with this disease. And as the person who came on previously, use common sense. If you've got the disease and you've got symptoms, stay at home. Try not to give it to somebody else, as you would do with flu or other viruses like the Nora virus. I think we can use common sense and our own judgment on this, so long as we protect those people who the disease might still kill.
I mean, there are people from the medical and scientific communities who are saying potentially this is coming way too soon. This could be a political move to distract from other issues that the Prime Minister has. Do you think that perhaps, we haven't heard from Sage, I think we're going to hear from them potentially this evening in a coronavirus press conference, perhaps our last, who knows. But does that alarm you that we haven't heard these proposals yet to be backed up by other members of the scientific and medical community who have been advising the government to date?
Not really. I mean, if you read the weekend's papers, you can read the best advice available from a number of epidemiologists, virologists, the person you had on your programme earlier. There are a range of views, some more protective, some more let's get back to normal views. So I don't think there's any scarcity of the views. I don't trust the Prime Minister. I have no doubt his motives are for his own survival, not for the protection of the public. But looking at that advice, I'm a member of the Science and Technology Committee, and I followed this epidemic all the way through. And I think at nearly every stage, the government has spent a great deal of money and wasted it, not on protecting the most at-risk people, but on protecting themselves by frightening the public and taking too many restrictive measures. And I think that's what the scientific evidence indicates at the moment. The vast anybody who wants to be vaccinated can be vaccinated. People who've already had the disease, they are pretty well protected. We all know that.
And if we are coming towards the end of, pandemic measures in this country, what is your appraisal of how we've dealt with this? Because arguably, the UK was the first country to vaccinate anybody, and it seems to me that England, at least, is going to be one of the first countries in the developed world to say goodbye to the coronavirus and see the light at the end of the tunnel.
I think the one bright spot in dealing with this epidemic has been the development very, very quickly, much more quickly than it's ever been done in history before, of effective vaccines. And I think we should be proud of our scientific community in being able to produce those safe vaccines that have worked so well. But if you read the National Audit Office report of the test and trace system, huge billions and billions of pounds have been wasted on that system for no effect. People were sent back into care homes untested, which led to the spread of the disease. We locked down people who weren't vulnerable to the disease. People over 70 are thousands of times more vulnerable to the disease than people in the 20s. But we damaged children by not educating them. We damaged children by not letting them socialise. And we locked up people and damaged the economy. And the government has not ever told us what both the health and economic consequences of those over-restrictions have been. So I think there's a big gold star for the scientific community and the government on vaccines, and there's a delta minus really for the rest of it in how the epidemic has been dealt with. They've restricted people who didn't need to be restricted and not protected those people who needed to be protected.
Graham, thank you ever so much. Lovely talking to you on my programme today. What do you think about all of this? Are you ready to get back out there and get back to the old normal? Well, GB News East Midlands reporter Will Hollis has been out in Nottingham today to find out your thoughts about the end of COVID restrictions.
It's time to move on because it's not going to go away. But on buses and enclosed environments, I think it's still a little bit uncomfortable for people. And even for myself, I feel a bit uncomfortable. But I'm vaccinated, so therefore I feel health-wise I'm okay, and we need to perhaps continue that moving on.
We have to live with the virus, but other thing, can we trust people not to infect other people? So it's a question of responsibility of other people. If they test positive or if they have symptoms, that they be very, very responsible, you know what I mean? So I think just throwing a blank canvas out there could be a bit of a wrong message. I think there should be somewhere where people should be responsible, you know what I mean? But we can't guarantee that.
You can't keep going on forever isolating, but then again, if you don't isolate, then we're going to go on forever, aren't we, sort of thing. So I don't know how to come to an arrangement with that, to be honest.
I think they should still keep the rules going. You should still have to wear your mask and that. Because I would not go anywhere without it. Never do. And I think you should keep the rules going. Really do.
It's dangerous. Actually dangerous. You don't know who's got it. I mean, do you go around with a big notice on, I've got COVID? No, you don't. You self-isolate, you take yourself away and look after it, after yourself. I've done it.
Well, Shaun Bailey joins me now, the former Conservative candidate for London Mayor and the former chair of the Police and Crime Committee for the London Assembly. Shaun, I mean, you heard some people being interviewed there in our Vox Pops, that they just don't seem to be ready for restrictions to be lifted. Graham Stringer agreeing with the lifting of restrictions, it seems he'd want them to have been lifted sooner, but suggesting that this could be a diversionary tactic by Boris Johnson to save his ailing premiership.
I think there's two things to be said. Firstly, dealing with COVID is separate from what goes in Parliament. If you're a PM, you'll always have something big to deal with. I think we do need to move on from the restrictions because of the cost of the restrictions. And let's be clear, I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about the other societal costs, people losing jobs, young people not getting the work experience they need, and, of course, the huge backlog of the NHS that needs to be dealt with. And every time you put in restrictions, you make sure those things aren't done. And when we listened to the Labour MP, he forgot to mention how in favour of lockdowns the rest of the Labour Party were. They wanted to lock down everything all the time. But as a country, we are now reaping the reward of all the hard work we've done. We spent billions of pounds of our collective money, and we've also had 2 lockdowns, and we wear masks everywhere, all manner of things. And at some point, that had to come to an end. And because we've been so good with the rules, I think that time is probably now.
It's the problem here that the government, like many other governments, might have essentially created a sort of mass Stockholm syndrome because they had to use extremely strident messaging to make people follow the restrictions while they were in place. And now there are people there who, you know, are frightened. They're very alarmed that these restrictions are suddenly disappearing.
In a sense, you are correct. The government had used some very forceful messages in the beginning because people simply didn't believe it. We had no experience of a pandemic, so we had to really push the message. And the same will be on this end. There'll be a tail end. There'll be a long tail of people coming back to normality. But that doesn't mean you don't change it. At some point, you do need to say to people, we are removing the restrictions. And, of course, the public are clever. We've been dealing with illnesses for years. Most people have dealt with COVID through pure common sense, and that's how they'll deal with changing the rules, pure common sense. If you are ill, you will check why you're ill and you won't go to work, you won't go to school. We don't need the government to tell us how to behave. We're grown-ups, we know what we're doing.
I mean, the tug-of-war seems to be over the concept of free tests here, and we understand there have been a protracted meeting with the Chancellor and the Health Secretary to discuss that, with seemingly Sajid Javid wanting the free testing to go ahead and Sunak saying, well, look, if that's what you want, it's got to come out of your own budget, we're not going to give you any more money. The UK spent more on free tests than foreign aid. Do you think that was the right move, or do you think it's almost just led to this virtue signalling where there are people out there testing every single day and putting it on Twitter for apparently no reason?
Look, we've spent what we spent. We were in unprecedented times, and you could argue that we could have spent a little less or a little more. The point is, we are now going forward dealing with COVID in the same way we would deal with the flu or we deal with any epidemic, coming at any sort of regular disease that returns to the public. We don't do free testing for everything else. It simply isn't sustainable. And what people have to remember, no government has any money. It's our money, and we want that money spent on other things. There's parts of the NHS budget that will lose money if it goes up, if we continue with free testing. Also, if it doesn't come out of the NHS budget, it will come out of somewhere else. And anybody who's in favour of a continuation of free testing should just merely tell us where the money's coming from.